They just don't know what to do. They're locked into a situation. It's sad. They just don't know what to do because Ukraine is gone. It's not Ukraine anymore. You can never replace those cities and towns, and you can never replace the dead people, so many dead people. Any deal, even the worst deal, would have been better than what we have right now. If they made a bad deal, it would have been much better. They would have given up a little bit, and everybody would be living, and every building would be built, and every tower would be aging for another 2,000 years.
Once Ukraine was a nation of beauty, history, and unbreakable spirit, a land where cities echoed with life, culture, and pride. But today, those echoes have fallen silent. What you see now are the remains of a country ravaged beyond recognition, a place where the dreams of millions have turned to dust. The headlines barely scratch the surface of this devastation. They may tell you stories of bravery, of resistance, of hope. But what about the reality beneath? The crumbling buildings, the broken families, the silent streets that were once alive with laughter? What if everything we're told about this war is only part of the story? What if the real truth is hidden in the shadows, far from the cameras and the news feeds? This is the untold story of Ukraine war, its heartbreaking loss, and the question left is, who's really winning this war, and at what cost? Ukraine has lost over 100,000 soldiers since the war began. That's more than the entire population of cities like Boulder, Colorado, or Cambridge, England. Ukraine is no longer a fighting force. It's a country fighting against its inevitable defeat. Ukraine's cities are in ruins. Its economy has shrunk by 30%. Over 8 million refugees have fled. Yet, President Zelensky continues to promise victory. How long can this mismatch between rhetoric and reality continue? The scale of devastation becomes even more apparent when we look at satellite imagery of major Ukrainian cities. Once bustling metropolises now resemble ghost towns, with entire blocks reduced to rubble. In Mariupol, for instance, more than 90% of residential buildings in Mariupol have suffered destruction. Almost half of Kharkiv's educational institutions have been destroyed or damaged in Ukraine's second-largest city. Yet, despite these grim realities, Western media still seem keen to portray an image of Ukrainian resistance and impending success. This disconnect between the situation on the ground and media narratives is striking. While it's true that Ukrainians have shown remarkable courage, the physical and economic toll of the war cannot be ignored. Experts estimate that rebuilding Ukraine could cost over $1 trillion, and that is around 5 times the annual GDP of Ukraine before the war. According to the World Bank, the poverty rate in Ukraine might rise as high as 65% by end of 2024 from 2% prior to war. That is leaving millions of Ukrainians who had led reasonably comfortable lives struggling for the basics. Already, more than 8 million Ukrainians have left the country, which creates a brain drain that will negatively affect the possible recovery of the national fabric. The war has completely paralyzed Ukrainian agriculture, a country often called the breadbasket of Europe. Ukraine used to be a top supplier of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil. Many of the farms remain abandoned or have been converted into battlefields. Global food security will be deeply worried in the long term or so. Even discounting the battle loss claims, there is no getting around the fact that Ukraine's infrastructure and economy are in tatters. The struggle for rebuilding would be a lengthy and difficult one, even if the war ends tomorrow. This is an essential part of the reality that must be grasped in considering Ukraine's circumstances now and into the future. As politicians squabble over tactics, as the media covers troop deployments, millions of Ukrainians are going through another level of war. Olena, a 34-year-old teacher from the city of Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, a year ago a Russian missile hit her apartment building, and since then Olena's life has never been the same. In a flash, she lost her home, the stuff she owned, and where she felt safe. She says, "I would stress over my students' grades. For now, I'm concerned about where I will sleep tonight and if there will be any food for me tomorrow." While Olena struggles to survive, what the people of Ukraine hear in nearly all official statements is one thing. President Zelensky describes pushing Russian forces away, but for Olena and millions of others like her, the scars from war are already permanent. Data provides detail on the human impact, and the numbers are unsettling. The UN said more than 646,596 civilians had been killed and injured since the start of the war. But these numbers are just the tip of the iceberg. Over 5.4 million Ukrainians are displaced inside their own country, often in temporary accommodations or with relatives in safer parts. The United Nations reported a month ago that perhaps 1 in 3 of Ukrainians suffers from PTSD. The fallout has bred anxiety, depression, and all manner of mental health problems among millions as a result of the fighting. Developmental delays and emotional distress are widespread among children who are uniquely vulnerable. Ukraine's unemployment rate has tripled, and based on estimates, almost 1/3 of the workforce is unemployed. For those who still have jobs, like Olena herself, now an online tutor whenever she can find a stable internet connection, salaries are frequently halved. Countless Ukrainians are using up their savings simply to survive. Amidst these challenges, avenues for resurgence open up. People are coming together to help each other as communities, sharing foods and places to stay as well as hugs. All over the country, volunteer organizations have formed to offer everything from medical care to evacuation help. However, these efforts, as heroic as they are, can never fully mitigate the scale and amount of suffering we witness. The true cost of this war is measured in shattered lives, not territorial gains. Each statistic represents countless personal tragedies, families torn apart, dreams put on hold, and futures thrown into uncertainty. As the conflict drags on, the cumulative trauma inflicted on Ukrainian society continues to mount, creating challenges that will persist long after the last shot is fired. Do you remember that high-profile Ukrainian army of 255,000 active personnel in 2022? Fast forward to today, and the figure itself remains uncertain. This isn't merely due to a mere numbers game. This is the ground we're standing on collapsing under Ukraine's defense. Examining present Ukraine military capabilities, Ukraine's armed forces appear to be holding out, on paper at least, with Western aid and gear funneled in by the billions. Finally, all this talk of buybacks and investment is empty. The reality on the ground tells the whole story. Even with all of the Western help that is poured in, Ukraine's forces are facing crippling shortages and too many casualties. The front lines reports look grim indeed, with soldiers running out of ammo and gear falling apart. At times, troops have had to ration back on their ordnance, crippling the capacity for troops to return fire at Russian strikes. One Ukrainian soldier, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, told NBC News, "We have met everything, shells, medicines, really all that is. It seems like we are fighting with one hand tied behind our backs." The situation becomes even more concerning when we consider the state of Ukraine's air defense systems. An allegedly leaked Pentagon document that sent shakewaves through military and diplomatic quarters claims Ukrainian air defense may have been exhausted by May 2023. If they go by this prediction, it could leave Ukrainian cities and key infrastructure exposed to even more heavy Russian airstrikes. Ukraine has claimed to have shot down as much as 70% of Russian missiles headed for its territory in the early months of the war, but recent data indicates this interception rate has fallen significantly, even at times reaching only 50% or less during heavy barrages. A second concern is the damage this long battle inflicts on troop morale. The warriors who once trudged into battle to fight no matter the odds, now leg-weary and demoralized. Even the strongest warriors are being broken by long tours, casualties among friends, and constant combat. According to a military psychologist who works with Ukrainian forces, we are witnessing an increase of combat stress and PTSD cases. These guys are on some serious problem, and it's interfering with their capacity to battle well. Meanwhile, the question about Ukraine's armed forces is how much longer they can sustain their current rate of operations. This relentless pressure on people and resources has begun to raise real concerns about sustainability of the model for the long term. Ukraine is racing against the clock. They must get something before the military potential of the opposition is wasted. The public view of the military might, as reported on in much of the Western media, this sensationalist, industrial-strength Russian military is more myth than reality. But while stories of Ukrainian determination and bravery abound between the headlines, the realities that its military is stretched to breaking point are far less reported. The unseen advance maps tell truths that words frequently hide, but when you look at eastern and southern Ukraine, a much more unexpected picture emerges, one that turns everything we thought was true about the progress of this war on its head. So, what does the land Russia now holds look like, and what does it mean for this war moving forward? About 18% of Ukraine is currently under Russian control. This is not only a number, statistic, but an ugly reality that, for many reasons, is hardly ever covered by media, which covers Ukrainian counter-offensives. Ukrainian victories have been trumpeted in headlines, but beneath the surface, Russia has worked to consolidate its gains and deepen its entrenchment in occupied territory. Now, let's us have a more detailed look on the map. Russia occupies entire slabs of the Luhansk area and most of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. The south is where they built them a land bridge to Crimea, which they annexed back in 2014. Especially big cities such as Mariupol and Melitopol. The strategic value of these territorial gains offers Russia key resources and increases their leverage in negotiations. Of particular worrying is the way in which Russia is incorporating these occupied territories into its bureaucratic framework. They are in the process of not merely holding territory, but of making it Russian. The ruble has been set as the currency in occupied areas, Ukrainian phone systems have been swapped for Russian ones, and locals have begun receiving Russian passports. According to a Ukrainian analyst, speaking on condition of anonymity in order not step away from politics until the end of elections, it's creeping annexation. Still, a day goes by and it becomes more difficult to reverse those changes. Time is on Russia's side. The longer the occupation continues, the more difficult Russian control becomes. It is not just an administrative process of integration, rather a cultural one. New Russian language schools are opening and Ukrainian books on history are replaced with Russian ones. It seems that the aim is to wipe out Ukrainian identity so it can be replaced with a Russian one in these territories. It has been a long game, which may partly explain why the Russian playbook looks less impressive on paper. They're not making smaller, headline-hitting advancements. Instead, they're just slowly steaming into solidifying control over what they have already taken. The challenge of verifying information from occupied regions. Few journalists can get in, and so few residents dare opens their mouths. Such an information vacuum allows Russia's silent successes to go unnoticed. Another point here is how the narrative of Russian failure in much of the mainstream media differs from these territorial successes. It is indeed true that Russia's first blitzkrieg to capture Kiev wasn't successful, but what is working now for them is this gradual consolidation. Russia's mindset has shifted away from seizing more ground, and is instead focused on entrenching its existing conquests. It also is one that is more difficult to counter and could have lingering effects on Ukrainian sovereignty. $75 billion, that's the amount pledged by just the US since 2022 alone to Ukraine. However, there is a catch. This immense amount has not paid off with tangible success in combat. But where is all this money actually going, and who benefiting from it? The answers might shock you. Since seizing the Ukrainian territory in a full-scale invasion last year, Western nations have opened their purse strings to Ukraine like never before. The US is the leader of the pack, but European nations also kicked in billions. This assistance takes the form of military materiel, financial aid, and humanitarian support. It sounds really great on paper, but when we look deeper, things become more complicated. To start, let's see just where this money is designed to flow. Much of it is set aside for military assistance, everything from anti-tank missiles to air defense systems. The other portion is intended to support Ukraine's flagging economy. Finally, humanitarian assistance to refugees as well as war victims, but that makes tracking this aid almost impossibly complex. However, the vast amount and nature of wartime assistance creates spaces for mismanagement if you leave aside corruption. As one senior Ukrainian official put it, "We appreciate the assistance, but at times it feels like we're trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it." They have announced that aid has not reached those who need it. Lost military hardware. Although there has been a deluge of economic assistance, it hasn't exactly led to better lives for common Ukrainians. Needless to say, this is a messy situation. Others say that such a huge influx of aid is simply stretching out a war the terms of which remain unchanged. Dr. Emma Thompson, a geopolitical analyst, explained, "Aid keeps Ukraine in the war but doesn't need to give them the tools for victory. If nothing changes, this may lead to an endless protraction of the fighting. It forces us back to asking unflattering questions questions about the reasons for aid from the West? Or is this really just another case in which FDR and Eisenhower, albeit unwittingly and indirectly, fought Nazi Germany to serve other geopolitical interests? The US and its partners definitely have a stake in the battle against Russian influence, but at what cost? Not to mention the potential longer-term repercussions. Ukraine depends on the West more every day for its continued existence. What if that support disappeared? Or you woke up one day and it was gone? The situation could be even worse for the country. In addition, the influx of non-permanent funds is transforming Ukraine's economy in an unreversed manner. An entire servicing industry has popped up surrounding foreign aid and military contracts. This offers short-term jobs but constitutes no foundation for long-term economic health. Such is the April stylization of President Zelensky. His unbending confidence has become a signature of this war. But what if these well-prepared speeches are causing more harm than good? Time to unpack the layers of Ukraine's wartime leadership and investigate the potentially catastrophic effects of Zelensky's behavior. When addressing the nation recently, President Zelensky said, "This war will be won by Ukraine." That's a perspective he has echoed time and again since hostilities erupted. However, as we saw in earlier chapters, the situation on the ground is much worse than that. But how does a leader manage to exude such absolute optimism amidst the collapse of his nation? We are so used to seeing Zelensky speak on TV. He has spoken in parliaments across the globe, made emotional speeches at international platforms, and remained active on social media ever since. The message is unchanging. Ukraine is doing fine, victory will happen, and the West should keep upping their game on support. However, let's contrast this kind of rhetoric with the accounts from the front lines. Zelensky suggests a victory is just around the corner, while soldiers in Ukraine say ammunition and equipment are becoming critical. But as he talks about freeing up land that's been taken, military analysts are pointing out how fixed and wide Russia's positions now are, all of which makes for a troubling disconnect when it comes to the leadership style of Zelensky. Is his positivity a needed morale booster for the battered country, or is it stopping Ukrainians from recognizing how much trouble they are in? Zelensky's preoccupation with retaining Western support has actually harmed Ukraine's interests. Some critics claim. Kyiv Mahila Academy political scientist Dr. Oleksiy Heron sees the risk that Zelensky's constant assurance of victory is creating an unrealistic expectation. This may result in disappointment and mistrust if those promises were not kept. This focus on military solutions takes away from any remaining hope for a diplomatic avenue. He has constantly asked for more weapons and harsher sanctions, but very little has been said publicly about negotiating or striking a deal. The all-or-nothing approach might be stretching out a stalemate that is proving unsustainable for Ukraine, as we are witnessing. Zelensky could be forced in a few months to contemplate what his alternative leadership style has wrought far beyond the war. If he links Ukraine's future so closely with the West, then he is creating a dependent relationship that has its own dangers. And then what if that support falters or is snatched away altogether? But Ukraine could find itself in an even worse place militarily and economically. There's also the question of how Zelensky's approach is shaping Ukraine's long-term prospects. His frequent appeals to the West have undoubtedly raised Ukraine's international profile, but they've also reinforced the narrative of Ukraine as a victim, constantly in need of rescue. This image could hinder Ukraine's ability to attract investment and rebuild its economy once the conflict ends. Now, beyond the current war, let's project realities that await most Ukrainians for decades, and a new economic picture for Ukraine and its bleak prospects. They estimate it will take the country 15 years to reach GDP levels that existed before the war. That's more than a stat. That's a generation of Ukrainians who face growing up in a country that has to start all over. That dream of a rich, Western-leaning Ukraine appears further away than ever. However, the issues extend past economics. Ukraine's demographic crisis could remake its population and society for generations, and the war has expedited a brain drain already in place. On the move, thousands of young, educated Ukrainians are leaving to find refuge elsewhere. Ukrainian demographer told in Diavolish, we are losing our future. Those who could rebuild our country are the ones most likely to be leaving. Also, the Ukrainian people are getting older and older, young people are leaving, and the number of working-age men killed or unable to work in the war is only forecasted to rise, putting additional strain on a rapidly dwindling workforce and burgeoning social services needs. The changing nature of the population could further complicate economic revival. Ukraine is also risking what we have been calling the frozen conflict nightmare. It is a scenario, experts say, that could see the country receding into a status familiar to observers of other post-Soviet states such as Moldova or Georgia, more than just an influence sphere for years, even decades, with parts of its territory under de facto Russian control. Not only would this not help Ukraine recover economically, but it also complicates its way towards European integration. What might this future mean in practical terms for regular Ukrainians? Picture cities with modern facilities next to ruins that were never rebuilt. Imagine being part of a generation that might never have witnessed a peaceful Ukraine, and families are separated all over Europe. Think about an economy where certain industries boom from reconstruction efforts, while others struggle to recover. The question is whether Ukraine can find a way to counterbalance these obstacles.